As part of the different research activities in G-squared Limblick, we aim at building unique datasets, which help in addressing relevant issues to the study of gender, labor markets, and growth in low and middle income countries. Although researchers in development have made great progress towards understanding the links between gender, jobs, and poverty at the micro level, our understanding of the dynamics at the overall macro level is still lagging behind. This is mainly because of the scarcity of credible and comparable data for low and middle income countries. Today, we are introducing the first dataset under the G-squared Limblick initiative and will be showing you the first set of preliminary findings. The Global Jobs Database. What's the Global Jobs Database? It's a publicly available dataset constructed by harmonizing the available micro datasets, which contain information on jobs and labor market activities in low and middle income countries. The idea is to create a multi-country macro dataset. For this purpose, the data contains three main sources. Census data from IPUMS, which contains a large collection of publicly available census microdata. Demographic and health surveys, or DHS, which collects nationally representative data on fertility, family planning, HIV, etc. But more relevant to our exercise is the fact that most DHS surveys also include a module on employment, which records crucial information on work characteristics performed by individuals. The third source is labor force surveys, which have been conducted by approximately 70% of low and middle income countries, but is only made available for a small set of those. For now, we completed the harmonization of IPUMS and DHS. This provides coverage of countries representing about 81% of the world's population and more than 90% of the population in low and middle income countries. Examples of information we are interested in include labor force participation, type of the job, is it wage, work, or self-employment, sector of the job, is it agriculture, manufacturing, or service, skill level, is it high-skilled jobs like managers and professionals, white-collar jobs, or blue-collar jobs, as well as migration patterns. We don't only show pooled averages across countries, but also show the averages across the two genders, different wealth quantiles as a measure of poverty, different education levels, different age groups, and cohorts. Why this dataset is important? There is limited availability of comparable datasets on jobs and labor market activities across low and middle income countries, although the existence of such data is essential for better understanding the characteristics of these markets. Think, for example, about the occupational structure and how equal or unequal the labor markets are with regard to gender and wealth, and how this differs across the development path. The dataset in this regard would be made publicly available for researchers to foster the study of labor and development. We can think of several uses for this data. To name a couple of those, the data can be used by researchers to compare particular settings to averages for different groups within one country or even across countries. This would enable researchers to get a sense of how widespread patterns are, and therefore understand the extent to which their research can be informative for other settings. The data can also be used to identify unexplained patterns in research and address different topics that have not been sufficiently addressed in the literature. The data covers a large set of low and middle income countries. This map shows the coverage of IPUMS data in our exercise. The data covers 68 countries, representing about 55% of the world population. Several of these countries have more than one wave of data, which would enable us to look at the time dimension and learn how things develop over time. For the DHS, 74 countries are represented, accounting for about 58% of the world population. So putting the two sources of data together gives this picture about the decent coverage of the current data set on low and middle income countries. We can say that this exercise is about building bridges across different data sources. And the starting point would be to build a bridge between census data and demographic and health surveys. We managed to harmonize a number of interesting labor market characteristics across the two data sources. These harmonized characteristics include being in employment, type of work, is it self-employment or wage work, measure for employment in the agriculture sector, and measure for being employed in high-scale occupation. We also harmonized data about assets, which enable us to build comparable wealth indicators that would be used to classify individuals into different levels of poverty, ranging from poorest to richest, and therefore help towards understanding patterns of inequality in the labor markets. I will come to this point in more details in the next slides. The two datasets contain also useful information that exists in only one of the datasets, but not the other, such as being in the labor force and working in the manufacturing or service sector in IPOMs, and for DHS being a family worker or being a paid worker, which is an important feature given that a relatively large share of women in developing countries work in unpaid jobs, in addition to indicators about seasonality of the work and fertility indicators. We use principal component analysis, or PCA, to build a wealth indicator. For that, we use the information on household assets, mainly durable goods, as well as dwelling characteristics. This enables us to estimate a wealth density for each country year survey. We compare the wealth densities from the two data sources, and we also compare and estimate density from DHS data against the wealth variable created by DHS data for a subset of countries. And then we export data with asset loadings as our measure of wealth score. This graph shows how the pattern of wealth score across IPOMs and DHS gives a comparable picture. Here we are showing Bolivia as an example. This wealth index distribution in 2003 from DHS and 2001 from IPOMs look very similar. This is the case also across other countries. The areas between the red lines represent the 5 quantiles, starting with the poorest at the far left of the graph and the richest at the far right. Interestingly, the graph tells a story about the economy of Bolivia, which looks bipolar, with a peak towards the lower end and a peak close to the higher end, but a smaller share of people in the middle. As another check of quality, we also compare the scatter plots between our constructed PCA predictive score as our measure of wealth against the wealth variable from DHS, which has been already constructed for a subset of countries. This graph is from Egypt as an example, and it clearly shows that the two measures of wealth, our measure and the one that was constructed earlier, correlate very highly together, suggesting that we are able to closely match the ranking in the distribution. To give you a flavor of how our measure of wealth is constructed, this table shows the ranking of assets in terms of negative and positive PCA loadings. Assets or house characteristics with high negative loadings are associated with being in the poor or poorest categories. This includes, for example, using wood as the main source for cook fuel and having earth or sand floor in the house. While assets or house characteristics with high positive loadings are associated with being in the rich or the richest categories. Those include, for example, better sources of cook fuel, such as liquefied petroleum gas. They also include items such as having access to electricity or owning a TV, etc. The harmonized dataset has also a panel dimension, given that a large set of countries have several waves of data. Therefore, questions related to changes in wealth over time, as well as changes over time for other characteristics, can be addressed. We are now going to give you an idea of the type of statistics that can be produced with the data that we have put together. The data gives us lots of ideas for research projects, and we hope this will be the same for you. So let's start from the beginning. This graph shows the share of people at work. Across different levels of economic development, measured by GDP per capita, the graph shows no pattern, suggesting that the share of people at work is roughly the same at around 70% across low and middle income countries. However, the averages, as often the case, hide lots of variations by type and sector of employment, and also across wealth quantiles and education levels. As development proceeds, the share of workers in agriculture falls, while the share of those who are in manufacturing and services increases. But coupled with that is a change in the composition of those who work. In particular, if we look at wealth, we see a drastic drop from 70% to 50% in the share of people at work in the poorest quintile, whereas the share of people at work in the top quintile of wealth remains stable at slightly below 60%. This suggests that the workforce becomes wealthier with higher levels of economic development. Education sends a similar message. The share of people at work with no education falls with development, while the share of people with higher education increases. So the workforce becomes generally more educated with economic development. The type of jobs change as well along the path of economic development. Wage employment steadily increases, while self-employment drastically falls. Wage jobs are more common among the richer and the most educated. We see here that the share of wage employment relative to all workers is about 20% in the poorest country for the richest people, and it increases to about 70% in the richest country in the sample. However, the share for the poorest people starts close to zero and only climbs to less than half. The transformation comes from the second quintile. This is the second richest quintile, which starts being close to the poor and up in the richest country being much closer to the rich. A similar pattern emerges with education. People with high education are more likely to have wage jobs, and people with no education are less likely, although both increase with development. The aim of G²Limlek is to look at gender, and so we have done lots of splits of the data by gender. The first thing we see here is what we all know, that men are more likely to work than women. But the true interesting things happen when we start splitting the data. So for instance, we see here that there is structural change for everybody, but this is quite gendered. Men move to manufacturing, while women move to services. There is also a gender component in the type of job. The wage jobs which are preferred by the rich and the educated are less likely to be held by women. If we compare women with children and women without children, we see that these differences are exacerbated with children. So presumably, the convenience of self-employment is valued more by women with children. As we saw earlier, richer people are more likely to hold the salary jobs. This works both for women and men. However, the gap is outstanding. The richest woman has the same curve as the poorest man. You see on the left we have men, on the right we have women. The dashed line is the bottom quintile of wealth, while the solid line is the top quintile. We see that the increase is steeper for women because they start from a lower base. But even then, the pattern for the richest woman is the same as the level for the poorest man. A similar pattern arises when we look at education. Men are more likely to hold a salary job, no matter what their education level is. However, it takes a higher education woman to reach the same level of salary jobs that a man with just primary education would get. Finally, anti-discrimination laws give a ray of hope. These laws seem to help. As a sanity check, we see that the purple lines for men's wage employment are the same in countries with and without anti-discrimination laws. So men are not affected, whereas women seem to be quite affected. In particular, women in the richest countries in our sample managed to reach the same level of wage employment as men with the help of anti-discrimination laws. Finally, we hope this short and quick overview convinced you that a lot can be done with this dataset. The data would hopefully allow you to better study jobs and poverty, because ultimately we have to understand the jobs of the poor to understand how to get them out of poverty.